Hi, my name is Jay Sampson, and today I'm going to give you a quick lesson on how to use the glazes in the studio and how to apply glazes on your pottery. But before I do that, I want to show you our glaze sample board so you can have an idea about the different glazes and colors that we have here in the studio.
Milonga de Ricardo en cha cha cha. Esta es la milonga de Ricardo en cha cha cha.
Enterraron por la tarde a la hija de Juan Simón. Era Simón en el pueblo el único enterrador. Él mismo a su propia hija al cementerio llevó. Él mismo cavó la fosa murmurando una oración. En una mano la pala, en la otra el asador, y todos le preguntaban de dónde viene Juan Simón.
Okay, so these are all the different glazes that we have in the studio, and we have samples of them, not just of each glaze, but on the different clays that they're on in the studio also. The name at the bottom is the name of the glaze, and the name of the clay is here on the side. So this particular glaze looks different on each type of clay that you put it over, and we have samples showing each one of those differences. So the first thing that you have to do before you start is you have to pick out a glaze that you want to use for your piece. And once you've done that, then we can continue on with the actual application of the glazing process. Okay, so the first part of the glazing process is probably one of the most important parts, and that involves mixing the glaze sufficiently. And there are several different ways that you can go about doing that in our studio. The first way I'm going to show you involves using an electric drill to mix the glaze up with, and that's located right here. I'm going to plug this in. I submerge this into the glaze about 1 inch from the bottom of the bucket and turn it on until it starts to mix the whole batch of glaze really sufficiently. Okay, so now the glaze is starting to mix really well when I see it start to have a spiraling vortex in the center of the bucket like that. And after about 10 seconds, it's probably good, mixed up well enough. Okay, the second way that you can mix the glaze is using one of these polished aluminum paddles, and you insert this into the glaze, move it back and forth, and around again until you're reaching the getting this sort of spiraling vortex. And this is really important to get all the different elements of the glaze mixed evenly in suspension with the water. That's really crucial to the glazing process. Okay. And just stay right there. I'm going to do one more of this. Okay, the third way that you can mix the glaze is using one of these small metal whisks. And this is better when you have one of the smaller buckets that we have mixed with glaze in it. We like this. So I'm going to agitate it and stir it again until I get this really whip it up good and get all of the thick glaze particles off the bottom into the suspension equally into the glaze. This is really important. Okay, so I'm going to be glazing this small shallow plate bowl form, and I'm going to be doing that using a pair of dipping tongs, and this is what the dipping tongs look like. I use them to grab my piece, and these are good for small objects that you can get the tongs on easily. Whoa! Once I've got it sufficiently in the tongs, then I just submerge it all the way into the glaze bucket. Swish it around a little bit. Okay, I'm dipping this, submerging it all the way in the glaze, and then moving it around a little bit. And I want a thin coat, so I'm not going to leave it in there too long. And then I pull it up and shake it to get all the drips off. And once it stops dripping, the glaze dries fairly rapidly. I can turn it back over, and then this piece is done. That's a clear glaze coat. Okay, so the first form that I showed you how to glaze was an open piece like this, and in that case I glazed the outside and the inside and the whole pot together. But generally, if you have a pot like this that has an inside and an outside, you always glaze the inside of your piece first. And you do that by taking some of your glaze and pouring it right inside here. And I fill this up about 1/3 with glaze. Then I'm going to go over here to the glaze bucket. And I'm going to pour the glaze back out into the glaze container slowly as I spin the pot to cover the inside of the pot evenly with glaze. And then I've got the inside covered with glaze. Then I have to let this dry for a little while before I can glaze the outside of it. Okay, so now I've got the inside covered with glaze, and now I want to put the glaze on the outside of the pot, and I'm going to do that by pouring it. But I'm going to pour only from here down with the pouring technique, and then I'm going to dip the top part after I do that. So I've got my pitcher full of glaze, I hold it over the bucket, and I rotate the pot all the way in one direction, start to pour, and then slowly rotate and spin the pot. Maybe I'll go back all the way around. So now I've got an even coverage of glaze around this part of the pot. And the glaze takes just a couple minutes to dry before you can touch it or handle it without leaving a mark or a smear in it. Alright, I've got about 2/3 or 3/4 of this pot glazed, and now I just want to finish doing the top in the same color that I've been doing the rest of the pot in. I'm going to do that just by dipping it. And shaking it a little, get the drips off. Now this piece is finished and ready for firing. Now I want to talk to you about another one of the crucial parts of glazing that beginning students have problems with, and that's understanding glaze thickness. And I've got this glaze mixed up good with the paddle, and now I want to get an idea about how thick or thin this glaze is. And one way I can do it is by putting my hand in it and just seeing how fluidly it drips off the end of my fingers. And I can also tell by how it coats my hand. My hand is coated very evenly with a fairly even distribution of glaze. I know that this glaze it's not real thin and watery, and it's not real thick and globby, so this is probably good for it. Has a fairly medium kind of thickness, and The other question that beginning students always have for me is they say, well, how long do I dip my piece in there to get enough glaze on it? And well, that depends on your piece, and it also depends on the thickness of the glaze in the bucket. So the first thing that you need to do is get a good idea about the thickness of the glaze in the bucket. And here in this instance, I'm going to take a small piece of a sample piece and dip it in the glaze. I know it's mixed up well. And when I pull it out, I can see how much glaze is on the surface, how thick the glaze is, or how thin it is. And that tells me exactly, now this looks a little bit thin, I should have dipped it in there a little bit longer if I wanted a little bit thicker, and if I wanted a little bit thinner, I could have dipped it a little faster. And now this is dried, and another way I can tell about exactly how thick it is to scrape a tool and drag a line through the glaze. And that tells me another idea about how much thickness I have of glaze covering the clay on the object. So if you look on our sample board here, you can see specifically with this glaze and this glaze that there are several different thicknesses of glaze applied on here, and different thickness of glaze will yield different kind of color results. This area has been dipped several times, and this area is thinner next to it. And this is the same glaze on different clays, and here this is very kind of off-white, and where it's thin it just becomes a very dull brown color. And this part happens because of the different thicknesses that the glaze are. So what I want to show you was exactly what I mean by what different thicknesses there are. Now in this particular piece, I've dipped this once very quickly into this glaze, and I've allowed it to dry. Now I'm going to dip a second dip, and I'm going to accumulate more glaze on that area, and in that area the color will be different than on the surface of the rest of the piece where I have one thin, quick dip. And the students are always asking me, well, how long do you leave it in there? And I don't count, I just look at the glaze and try to see it visually building up on the surface of the clay. Now, if you can see this pot, this area is got quite a bit thicker glaze on it than the area next to it. That's similar to the glaze samples that I just showed you, that one glaze where it's thicker can have one color, and then when it's thinner it can be another color. And that change in color has a lot to do with the thickness, even though it's the same glaze. Now I hope here you can see that visually this glaze has accumulated sufficiently more surface material on the pot than the area next to it here, and that can create a significant amount of color change in some glazes. This piece has a nice stamped design pattern on it, and it also has a very tight top to it. So I'm going to show you a trick about glazing the inside of this with something that has a very tight top. And I've also picked out a glaze that's going to highlight or accent this stamped pattern that I have on here, and that glaze is called matte mauve green. So now to glaze this tight topped piece, I have a funnel, and I filled my pitcher up with glaze, and I'm just going to go ahead and pour it in the top here. I'm not going to fill it up, I'm just going to partially fill it up. And now I'm going to come over here to this bucket of glaze and switch this around a little bit. And again, pour it slowly as I rotate the piece. Let all the glaze come out. And then I'm sure I've covered the complete interior of the piece with glaze. And it's really important because in some pieces, as in this piece, I have a lot of joints in here, and I want to be sure I have glaze in there, and that'll help bind this thing together and seal it as it goes through the firing. Now the inside is glazed and the pot seems to be dry enough, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to dip it into this matte mauve green, and I want to keep it pretty thin so that I don't lose my nice stamped decoration here. I'm going to hold it by the top and I'm just going to push it as far as I can in there. Oh, that's good. And quickly pull it out and shake it and get all the drips off. Oh, that looks good. That's a nice glaze coat. Nice and even. Okay, cut that one. I've dipped this in the glaze now and I've let it dry sufficiently so that I can handle it, which just takes a moment or two. And if you want to see what that looks like, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dip it to the top, just barely overlap this glaze line so that I can get the top of it done too. I'm just going to hold it right here by the side and just push it in there real quickly. Oh, that's good. Give it a little spin. And I always like to shake it to get all the drips off. Okay, then that's good. Now my pieces are glazed, but they're still not ready to be fired until I do one thing that's really important, and that's clean the bottom. Now I have to clean all the glaze off the bottom where it's going to sit on anything flat, because if the glaze is underneath and it melts, it's going to stick to the kiln shelves that it sits on when it's being fired. And I clean that by using a wet sponge and rotating the pot back and forth over the surface of the sponge like this until I remove any of the glaze on the bottom and up around the edge a little bit on the side like this. And that's really important. If you don't do that, your pieces won't get fired to begin with. Now, these pieces I've already glazed, and this has glaze on the bottom. We also have this carpet padding here we put on the sink, and it gets wet, and you just press your glazed piece down into this padding and spin it, rotate it, and it will also remove the glaze that's on the bottom of your pot, like this. I like to use the sponge myself. And you want to be sure the glaze on the inside of this edge and the outside, just take that glaze back a little bit off the edge. And this is also why you need to know about how thick your glaze is on your piece, because if it's really thick, you need to remove a little bit more, and if it's thin, you don't have to remove quite so much. Okay, here's another one that's done in clear glaze. You can barely tell that that's glazed. It looks very much like the color of the clay, but I put a thin coat of clear glaze on this, and I still have to be really sure that I clean the bottom of this. So I get a damp sponge and press it up a little bit and rotate the object in a circular motion. And when it's clean, I can see all this raw area of the clay on there without any little spots of any bits of glaze on there at all. And this is really critical if you want to get your work fired, because if we pick it up and go to put it in the kiln and there's glaze down here, we won't put it in. We'll put it on the reject shelf. And you don't want your stuff on the reject shelf. Okay. So as you can see, glazing can be pretty messy business, And with a small glazing area like this and the large amount of people that use it, it's really important that you clean up everything, and especially while the glaze is still wet, because as the glaze dries, it turns into a powder and it can create dust and get very messy, and it can also get in other glazes and it can contaminate some other glaze if you're not careful. So it's really important that when you finish glazing, you go ahead and you clean up all of your mess. This paddle's got to be clean. These have to be clean. The area that I worked in has to be clean. And the only way that this studio can really function is if we all really make the effort to clean up after ourselves, especially during the glazing process.